That's whenever you're.
Yeah, sure thing. So, hey everyone, my name is Hasith, and I'll be your presenter today. Welcome to our second workshop in the big project, where we'll be talking today on the fundamentals of prototyping, and we'll also be going over prototyping with Dart and Flutter. Before I begin, I'd first like to UTS Tech Society would like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, upon whose ancestral lands our city campus now stands. We would also like to pay respect to the elders, both past and present and future, acknowledging them as the traditional custodians of knowledge for this land. Let's quickly go over sort of an overview as to what we're going to be covering today. And I think the first question that we need to answer at the start of this night is, what is a prototype, and what does it mean to have a prototype ready to submit for the big project? And there are a few key things that we sort of want to clarify with that question. The second thing we'll be covering is a bit about the design thinking methodology. For those of you who did attend our big project launch last week and the following Agenic workshop, you will have already gone through a bit of the design thinking methodology, but we're going to be focusing on that sort of branch, that link between the ideate and prototype phase. The third thing that we're going to cover is what to include in a prototype, and in particular, what to include in your prototype for the big project. Because there are certain key things that you will want to include over other things. And it's important to sort of know these things so that when it comes to presenting your final solution, you're presenting the best thing possible. Number 4 is mapping out the next 2 weeks, because you're currently in your second week of the big project. You will have roughly 2 weeks left to implement your solution. And it's really important that we try and make the most of those 2 weeks, and I'll be covering some tools and resources that you can use there. The fifth thing will be a quick overview of Dart and Flutter, and a bit of demos explaining some of the features that make Dart and Flutter such a useful combination of tools to prototype your solution for your big project prompt. Number 6 will be ending with just a bit of going over a bit of the criteria involved with the big project, and how those particular areas of the criteria need to be addressed by your solution or your prototype. And we'll be ending with a bit of a Q&A where I'll try and offer some answers to some of the questions you may have, whether that be about Dart and Flutter or just prototyping in general. So let's move on, and let's start by answering the very first question. What is a prototype? And I think it's really important that we understand that a prototype represents an early sample or approximation of a final product. The main aim of a prototype is to determine how the product or solution will function. It also focuses on the design and feel of this solution, and allows for critical design issues to be solved. Something that's really important to note here is it's mainly that cross between the functionality and how the end user will interact with it. And those are the two main things that a prototype aims to sort of solve and try to identify and also refine as a result of iterating on the prototype. So a question that you might ask is, how does a prototype really differ from a proof of concept? Well, a proof of concept is really there to try and prove a concept. And a proof of concept is mainly trying to determine whether a solution can be built or not. So it's really important that with your prototype that you're trying to ensure that you're tackling a feasible idea, but probably in a new way or a new form, so to speak, depending on what platform you decide to distribute it on. And that's how it differs from a proof of concept. The next thing is, how about MVP, minimum viable product? Well, an MVP is, in its essence, a minimal yet usable sample of your solution. And it is ready to be released. It's got the core functionality, it's got all the features, and it's ready to be put out into the market and tested by the users. And essentially, you might do this through sort of like a phased delivery method where you slowly roll it out into the market, You might want to do it like a parallel if you have another sort of solution out there that you want to sort of link it up next to, and sort of hop the old users over to your new platform. But it's really about it's ready to be put onto the market. And really with a prototype is you're still making those key decisions on the functionality or the design of your application. So those are really important questions that we must ask when we consider the whole question of what is a prototype. Next, we'll just quickly continue this, continue with the design thinking methodology. So for those of you who do know, the design thinking methodology has quite a few phases in it. And last time you guys covered the sort of the define and also empathize sections, where empathize, you really empathize with your stakeholders or your end users. And define is where using that empathy, you've sort of understood their struggles and their concerns, and you've used that to define a problem. And then you get to the ideate stage, where in last week's Agenic workshop, you did cover the ideate phase, where you did sort of generate a few ideas. The ideate phase and its transition to the prototyping phase is where you need to sort of narrow down your ideas. And the top question that like I get asked, like because I've worked on a few prototypes in the past, and when my friends have asked me, how did you get all your ideas and sort of pick the best one? And then there are a few sort of methods that you can actually utilize. And some of the common methods is you might want to start doing some brainstorming, sort of really brainstorming, storyboarding, or sketching. And the real aim of those sort of methods is to try and flesh out these ideas a bit more. And then by fleshing out these ideas, you can sort of isolate the pros and cons a bit more. By isolating these pros and cons, then you can sort of weigh them with one another. But usually when you get to this sort of using this method of whether it be brainstorming, storyboarding, or sketching, sometimes you sort of get attached to an idea. You put all that effort in trying to make it work, visualizing it, and then you start to look at it more as a sort of an attachment, and you really don't want to let go and choose other ideas. So it becomes really quite a bit of a struggle. So two other methods that I want to propose to you or bring up to you guys is the first one is the 4 categories method. And some of you may have heard of it. Essentially, the 4 categories method essentially allows you to categorize your ideas into 4 different categories. And those 4 categories are most rational, most delightful, darling, and long shot. And essentially, this allows you to sort of look at it from a different perspective. What happens if we want to look at it from the perspective of the end user? Which one would be the most rational sort of idea that they would go with, or the idea that will give them the most joy? Or which one, from the perspective of the developer, which one is more of a long shot in terms of implementation? Or from the perspective of a developer, like I mentioned before, you get attached to these ideas. So which one is the more darling idea that you sort of don't want to let go of? And then the second method is the 6 thinking hats method. Now this one's a bit more obscure, and it's we're going to be covering these 2 methods in the following slides, and really just doing some exercises on trying to understand how this can really help. But the 6 thinking hats method involves 6 different colored hats. And they involve the following areas, which is facts, emotion, benefits, ideas, planning, and judgment. And essentially, you can think of each one of these hats as their own accessible criteria. They essentially allow the developers or your team to really try and look at each idea from the perspective of a different lens, whether that be factually, what are the facts associated with this idea? What does this idea make me feel emotionally? What are the benefits of it? What are some ideas that we can sort of do in the long run? What are some potential opportunities for growth? And there's also planning. How would we plan out building this idea? And judgment, sort of looking at it in a negative context. So we'll first start off with the 4 categories method. And so, like I mentioned before, it comes down to these 4 categories, and they're most rational, which covers essentially the most logical idea. And usually when you think of the most logical idea, it's usually one that what makes the most sense in terms of the problem statement. It directly attacks it head on. Uh, there's no real room for misunderstanding the idea. You can immediately see how it benefits the solution. And then it often provides the highest amount of utility and benefit given the amount of effort put in. So there's that sort of idea of efficiency associated with the most rational idea. And that really helps in terms of understanding which one is the sort of, in general, the best one to go with. Um, then the second category is the most delightful. And this is the idea that will provide the highest levels of gratification and pleasure to the end user. So that could be things like it could be visually appealing, the application. It could be on platforms that occupy most of the market share. And it might have a unique spin or twist on it that really engages with the target audience. The third category is darling, like I mentioned before, and that's where your favorite ideas would go, be placed in there. And usually we use the darling category to sort of fit in and like put our ideas that we really, really love a lot, but they sort of don't fit into other categories. Usually with the darling idea, it's really great to see once you get to the sort of analyzing each idea in their respective categories to see what makes that idea such a delightful idea. And then usually the great thing about the four categories method is really extracting those features that make it so worthwhile and so amazing, and then implementing it probably to the most rational idea. So yeah, it's usually where you put the darling categories, where you usually put your ideas where they don't really fit into other categories, but you really do like it. And then you also have the long shot. And the long shot is the fourth category. And that essentially is ideas that are really tough to get right. And these can be ideas that are really, really large in scope, or they can be even just small in scope, but it's a very niche area that you're dealing with. But there is a lot of risk associated with pursuing this idea, but there is a huge reward if you are successful with pursuing this idea. So there is those sort of ideas where like it might be a long shot, and then you need to appropriately consider, okay, is this doable? And especially because your team has 2 weeks left at this point in time, it's really important to understand when an idea is too big to tackle. And so the steps to really run this method is, as a team, just get together, brainstorm some ideas, and really just get it all out there. It can be on a whiteboard, a virtual whiteboard, or it can be through a Word document, and really just try and fit it all into one sort of document or resource. And then essentially what you want to do is you want to then split off into your smaller subgroups within your team, and that may be like just one person in each subgroup, but essentially split off the ideas evenly, and then allocate 1 or 2 of your ideas into each one of these categories. Then list the pros and cons of each idea and respective to their category. So you'd probably start off with the most rational, and you say, okay, this is a pro of why this idea is the most rational. And this is a potential con of this idea, and why it probably sort of like doesn't make it the most rational idea. And it really helps in terms of narrowing down what sort of features you want to bring into your final application and what sort of features you want to exclude from your final application. Because usually when you try to develop a solution, you can sort of include unnecessary features. And unnecessary features is just going to bloat the amount of work that you need to do. And you only want to include, as we mentioned before, with a prototype, the core functionality and designs that are necessary to maximize the user's experience. So going back to last week's Agenic workshop, there were some really great ideas posted onto that Miro board. And I just wanted to highlight and allocate some of them to these respective categories. So one of the ideas was a sleep tracker. I believe that the sleep tracker would probably go into the most rational idea, especially with because it's dealing with COVID. Sleep has been a big issue, and this directly helps with people that are struggling to keep a great sleep cycle. So putting that sleep tracker solution into the most rational idea, it does provide a direct solution as to how can you help someone through these tough times that we're currently in. Probably the most delightful one was the disco solution, or the disco idea, where it is essentially a video conference call, except it's a disco and essentially everyone can dance on a video call. That would probably provide the most delight to the end user at the end, because I mean, who doesn't love dancing? But also, it also just encompasses that idea of it directly. It tackles the solution, but it provides the highest level of gratification and pleasure to the end user. For Darling, this is more of this is really opinionated. So when I looked through the Miro board, I saw the Gladys workout and that idea. So I thought to myself, hey, that's actually pretty good. And I really love that idea. And while it's probably not the best, I definitely like it. So we're going to put in the Darling category. And Longshot. One of the ideas I also saw on the board was a virtual community garden. And now virtual community garden sounds amazing, but in the scope of 2 weeks, how would you go about implementing that? That does seem like a longer term project, but if you could get it right, if you could implement it, if you had the time, the resources, there is definitely a huge benefit associated with picking that idea. So that's definitely why it would be in the long shot category. So you can sort of see how by putting it into these categories, you can find some sort of key elements that determine why it actually goes into that category. So if we're going to look at the pros and cons of the sleep tracker app, potentially a pro for that sleep tracker application is that it improves people's sleep cycle. It essentially allows them to better their well-being and their health, actually. And potentially a con that may sort of pull it away from the idea of being the most rational is probably you might need a hardware component to probably track the sleep. So that would require a lot more effort to be put in and a lot more work to be put in, which probably draws it away from the 2-week time frame that you meant to implement it in. In regards to the most delightful application, which was the disco idea, the pros of that idea could potentially be, yes, it will provide the most benefits to our users, it'll provide the most happiness to our users, and they'll be really satisfied. But a potential con of that would be, okay, once again, can we set up a video conferencing application within the 2 weeks? And also, what are the chances of and what happens if there is people that don't want to turn on the camera? How can they still participate in the disco idea? The Darling idea, really pros and cons for this one, for this category, is really heavily opinionated. So pros of that is it's a really humorous way, so to speak, of trying to get your exercise in. And a con would be, well, I can't think of a real con of that. I think it's a good way to get your exercise. But moving on to the long shot category, the pros, of course, would be a lot easier for this category to isolate. But a pro would be that it is a huge idea to sort of get your community all together, to reinstill that sort of social connection aspect, especially during COVID. But the con is, once again, how would you ensure that you could get this running and working within 2 weeks? And that's usually some of the ideas that you can do. And I know that a lot of the cons associated with scope, but then it allows you to realize, okay, maybe these 4 ideas, they might not be best suited for the 2 weeks that we have. So let's put another 4 ideas into the categories. But we're not going to do that. We're going to actually move on to the next method, which is the 6 thinking hats method. Now, the white hat, this hat, as I mentioned before, it's the facts hat. So it focuses on neutral objectivity, the facts and figures associated with the idea. And it's really important that the data and information factor in to that sort of thinking hat, especially. It's really important because this can really reflect on sort of the impact of your idea and also the sort of scale of your idea. The red hat focuses on emotional perspective, gut reactions and feelings. So how does the application make me feel? It's important that when you're wearing this hat, to sort of look at it from two different perspectives. How does it make me feel in a positive way, and how does it make me feel in a negative way? And this sort of ties into two other hats, which I'll get into later. And the first one of which is the yellow hat. So the yellow hat focuses on the positives, the benefits of the ideas, what makes the ideas so great that it's better than other ideas. And what are some potential optimistic outcomes of pursuing that idea? Is there potentially some long-term benefits of pursuing that idea? And especially with the prompt that you all have been given, it is important to also consider those long-term benefits. The next one is the green hat, and the green hat focuses on further ideas or further ideas for the current idea. Probably reword that a bit, but probably opportunities for growth with the current idea. So is your idea scalable in the long run in terms of, can you add new features to it? Can you probably target new demographics by tweaking some of the functionality? And this is really where your creativity as a team shines, because your creativity will allow you to think of these new ideas and sort of tie them to the initial problem that you define in the second stage of the design thinking methodology. And it can also go beyond the prototype for ideas for growth. And if you wanted to pursue this idea in the long run, what sort of ideas for functionality can you think of? The blue hat is probably what I'd call the leader hat. It really focuses on the planning of the processes involved in regards to pursuing the idea. So from beginning to end, the person wearing the blue hat would understand, okay, this is what needs to be accomplished over the course of the 2 weeks or the 4 weeks that you have. And usually whoever wears the blue hat dictates the use of the other hats. So you usually assign the blue hat to your team leader, and everyone else would get other hats. And the blue hat would be sort of in charge of allocating, okay, maybe we'll hear from the white hat or the red hat or the green hat and such. And finally, the black hat. And the black hat focuses on being judgmental on the ideas. And it's pretty much the opposite of the yellow hat. And the main reason for this is because you also need to approach your ideas with caution and care, and really have a look at what could potentially go wrong with this application, and what sort of things have we not really realized as a negative side of the application. And it's really important that you consider the sort of dual perspectives on it, the positives and the negatives, because those are sometimes questions that can be asked of you during your pitches as to, have you thought about the negative side effect of this? So it's really important that we sort of consider that black hat as well. In regards to the 6 hats, I think one of the methods that you can use to implement this method is you can assign 1 hat to each person. Or if you're a bit low on the numbers of your group, you can give multiple hats to multiple people. And something I do recommend for smaller groups, maybe groups of 4 lower, I do recommend that you all wear the same hat at the same time. So everyone wears the white hat at the same time, and you sort of cycle, and everyone sort of contributes. Okay, this is one fact I've thought about for this idea. Here's another fact. Here's some piece of information or data that we can sort of consider with this idea. And you sort of cycle between each of the hats and try and get the most out of it as a team, to try and isolate those really key points that allow you to determine the worth of your idea and its sort of its worth in terms of pursuing it as your final prototype. So these hats, these 6 thinking hats, are really good. And I think I'll go through an example, just because I think doing the 6 thinking hats method is probably one of the better ways of isolating better ideas from not so good ideas. So I'm not going to use the same prompt that you all have used or are currently using. I just made a example prompt based on a prototype that I have done in the past. So the prompt is, in today's day and age, cryptocurrencies are dominating the public eye. As a result of this, many young individuals have taken up an interest in investing, not only into these cryptocurrencies, but the broader stock market as a whole. However, many young individuals leave high school without being taught the fundamentals of investing. How can we address this issue? So we'll keep coming back to the slide to sort of go over the prompt a bit more, but we'll move on to an idea. Then this is an idea for a prototype that I have had in the past for just a prototype that I want to make, but I've sort of attached a prompt to it. So the idea is a stock market simulator. It will contain graphs displaying stock values over time and a scrollable and searchable list of the top 200 ASX listings. When the user first enters the application, they will encounter a tutorial which will guide them through the basics of the program, familiarizing themselves with the terms associated with stock trading. So this was just an idea that I've had in the past, but really trying to aim and solve the problem that was presented by the prompt. So using the six thinking hats method, let's start off by wearing the white hat. So what do we know about this prompt and what does this prompt tell us? So we go back, what do we know? Okay, so we do know from this prompt that many young individuals have taken up an interest in investing. So we can already see as a fact or some data and information from this prompt is that we're mainly targeting young individuals who are interested in investing. What is another piece of information? The second part, which is, however, many young individuals leave high school without being taught the fundamentals of investing. So that's another point of data or information that we can use, that we need to be focusing on the fundamentals of investing. And also that our young individuals are predominantly those who are probably in their later stages of high school, looking at the stock market, not ready to invest because maybe they might not have turned 18 yet, but also those who have just left high school. So we've gotten some information, some facts out of our prompt by wearing the white hat. And it's really important that we keep these in mind. We keep these sections in mind throughout the whole process. So we'll go back to the hats. And so we've answered the questions, what do we know? And we know that we're targeting mainly young individuals, and we're looking to teach them about the fundamentals of the stock market. And what does this tell us? So we can this is where a little bit of inferring comes in from the data. And what we can tell from this prompt is that many young individuals don't know the fundamentals of the stock market or investing. So we should be targeting the fundamentals and maybe include a tutorial. And as you can see in my idea, I've said that when the user first enters the application, they will encounter a tutorial that will guide them through the basics of the program. So really trying to tie that data, that information that we got from the prompt to the idea and say, okay, we know that this is an area of concern, so this is going to be a core bit of our functionality. The red hat, let's move on to the red hat. So how does this make us feel? And so you can look at this from the perspective of a developer or a project manager. So if you are more on the project management side of things for this, for the big project. But what you can sort of also understand is try to look at it from a personal lens as well. I mean, I believe we were all high school students at one point. So we sort of do understand what it might be leaving high school and then going into the adult world and realizing, wait, I have not learned this in high school, whether that be taxes or something, but in this case, the stock market. So as a high school student, or as a recent school leaver, I left school 3 years ago, it makes me feel a bit sort of anxious or cautious. It makes me a little hesitant to enter the stock market. And I think that's something that really sort of pushes me away from the stock market if I was thinking from the perspective of a high school student. And that's on the prompt. Now, if we apply the same question to the idea, I think that the idea provides some merits in terms of it offers a tutorial to teach the fundamentals of stock investing. There is no mention as to what platforms it's going to be delivered on. So maybe that might be somewhere where we can improve it, improve on the idea. And also, how does it make us feel in terms of like interacting with a stock market simulator? Is that something the best way that we think that we can sort of learn about the stock market? And yeah, that's a question that can be asked. And the second point is, how will stakeholders feel? And sort of this can be high school students or young individuals. But also in the case of thinking about it from a different perspective, maybe look at it from the perspective of teachers who do want students to know about the fundamentals of investing and the stock market. And how does this idea of a stock market simulator make them feel? It probably make them feel a bit happier in terms of knowing that the students are a lot more educated in terms of the stock market fundamentals that may help them in their subjects such as business studies to a small extent, or economics to a small extent. So it might be beneficial towards their other studies and provide them with some secondary knowledge. And yeah, so it's important to also consider, like, maybe there might not be direct users, but from impacting the end user, the people around the end users, how would they be impacted as well? So a red hat's a really great way to look at it like that as well. And a negative also, the negative idea of wearing the red hat as well, to look at the negatives. So as I mentioned, the idea didn't present us with platforms, and that's really something where we got to sort of delve into it a bit more and sort of think, okay, we need to provide platforms and explain our platforms and decide what platform we're using so we can directly target the young individuals that need this solution. So, and also in terms of how will stakeholders feel about us pursuing this idea. So really looking at it also from a negative light, and also thinking, okay, what are some potential negative ramifications of stock market simulators to young individuals? I mean, if you want to go and reach like a sort of, if you just want to sort of go straight into the negatives, you can definitely think that, okay, maybe if we're providing them with fake money, it can provide them with sort of like bad habits that they invest and they fail in their investments, but they keep investing because they have that fake money, and that may reinforce bad real world habits. But that's sort of reaching with that sort of thing. But that's definitely something that can be considered when wearing the red hat, and any sort of negative or positive perspective should be factored in. So the yellow hat, what works with this idea? So I think what really works with this idea is the real benefit of providing the tutorial. It's providing that layer of interaction that really draws in young individuals and makes them think, wow, okay, this is a program this is sort of an application I'd like using because it's sort of gamified, and also see the benefits of I'm learning something while playing this. So I think that is that good. The good part of that idea is that sort of cross between the learning aspect of it and also the recreational side of it. And the benefits are in the long term that we will address the problem, which is that students don't know the fundamentals of the stock market or investing. So we're directly trying to look for those benefits there. The green hat. So what are some alternatives to this idea? So maybe if we didn't want to look at the game sort of scenario, how about an application that has sort of a tutorial, but not really a tutorial, but more so a online learning platform for just the stock market and investing. So that's one alternative that can potentially come up with. But in regards to the second point, I think this really is a great point, because I think as a part of your pitches, there will be some element of what have you got planned for the future? What are some ideas that can be expanded on? And I think a great question to ask is, how can we innovate on this idea and potentially grow it in the future? So for example, with the stock market application, maybe gamify it a bit more, maybe introduce some element of competition involved between students so that it sort of draws them in a bit more and they will learn a bit more. Maybe use some more, add more stocks to it, add more markets, introduce the concepts of international trading, or like the prompt suggested, introduce cryptocurrencies into it to try and give them the sort of freedom to learn more. And maybe by gamifying it and expanding the reach, you can pit schools against one another and sort of make it a school-wide, sort of a country-wide sort of thing. And the rooms for expansion are endless because ideas are always going to be scalable. But it is important to sort of keep some of these ideas in mind because they can really flesh out what foundational features that you'll need to sort of grow on them. Finally, the blue hat. So how do we approach this idea from the perspective of the problem? So if we were looking at this idea, I think the top three things would have to be, if we're looking back on core functionality, design, and then focusing on the users, I think looking at the design, it should be a simplistic application. There shouldn't be too many complicated words in terms of associating with stock trading. And it should be a very simple introduction that will teach the fundamentals. So that would be the design element. So it would be a really simplistic application. When looking at the functionality, we want to have some sort of tutorial component or a lot more literal sort of definitions within the application, because with a stock market application, you might tend to have things like a lot more numbers appearing on the screen, and you might not be able to translate exactly what those numbers mean. And really provide a more literal definition as to what's happening in the market. And finally, the user focus. So making this application accessible for all young individuals. Maybe make it a web application that can be distributed on the web, or maybe a desktop application for both the Windows and Mac OS X platforms, and also Linux. So it's also important that at this stage with the blue hat that you're thinking, okay, so we've sort of got this idea, how can we sort of break it down so that we include these core features in our final prototype that we submit? And so the blue hat will think of, okay, maybe we can define sort of some epics or some stories or some features for this solution. And that's where the whole sort of planning aspect comes from. And what are some important considerations we should make? And I'm sure most of you have done some project work in the past. And when you're creating a project, you often make assumptions, thinking that, okay, maybe we can assume that 50% of our users are going to be on Windows, 50% of our users are going to be running our application on a Mac. Or you can say 100% of our users will have access to a web browser. So these are some important considerations to make, and these will really factor into your final pitch and trying to justify why you approach your solution from a certain direction, because you want to try and help your target audience by solving the problem with your solution. And finally, the black hat. So what part of this idea doesn't make sense? So maybe from this sort of perspective is individuals are more like, so for example, with the students, the prompts suggested that they are more interested in investing in cryptocurrencies. However, sometimes the students with this application, with this current idea, it's only sort of showing them the ideas, it's only allowing them to invest into the top 200 ASX stocks. So it's that idea of trying to still make the students interested, but also making sure that they're getting that fundamental knowledge and learnings. So that the part of the idea that doesn't make sense or doesn't work is potentially the lack of engagement, because there has been interest from students, according to the prompt, in cryptocurrencies, not just the stock market. So that could be potentially one drawback. And what could go wrong with this idea? So something that could go wrong with this idea is potentially that we might not be able to support many users like accessing this application at once. For example, this said young individuals. So you're going to have to think about, okay, maybe some seniors in high school and also some recent high school leavers. They want to learn about the stock market. How many users does that mean? How many users should our application help? Or how well does our application scale? Whether it be a web application or a desktop application, will it be slow? Will it be fast? And what sort of external data sources can be there? And that's a real technical side of things. But you can also think as to what could go wrong with the idea from a process standpoint, from a business process standpoint. For example, maybe in regards to investing in stocks, you might not be able to access the data that's required, like to like sort of, sorry, sorry, you wouldn't be able to access the data that has the stock prices and such due to some legal conditions and such. That was a problem that I did face with my prototype, that I wasn't able to access the data that I required. So it resulted in me trying to find a workaround for the solution. So yeah, that's essentially the 6 thinking hats method. I have spent quite a bit of time on it, but it is a really great way to sort of isolate those key good features and those features that, those good ideas from those bad ideas, and really outweigh one another. See which ones outweigh one another, and trying to take one idea to the next phase, which is the prototyping phase. And then this is where you have to decide, okay, what are we going to include in our final prototype? And this is the question that needs to be asked, because it's really important that you aren't spending too much time doing other things, including unnecessary things in your final prototype. So the first thing I wanted to cover is review designs. So on the right, this is a wireframe, a UI design that I did for the stock market simulator. I did this in a program called Adobe Illustrator. I probably spent a couple of hours on it at the most, trying to give it a rough idea of what the final application would look like. And at this stage, when you're finally got your idea and you want to sort of make this idea or make this prototype from this idea, it's really important that you iterate on the designs, the UX UI designs for your final solution, because I think it's really important that everyone in your team has had a look at the ideas. Has had a look at the designs and has offered their own critical view on it. So for example, this design on the right, while I did spend a couple hours on it, this was a couple of hours on the, I believe, 4th iteration of it. And I've had 3 other previous iterations where elements were different colors, a lot more text, and thanks to some critical feedback from my peers, and also in the case of the application of a few key stakeholders, I managed to simplify it a lot more. And this is really important because in the end, you want to especially get your designs vetted by the stakeholders. So reach out to some people that potentially could be impacted by your application and ask them, hey, does this look intuitive to you? Does this make sense to you as to what would happen if, for example, I clicked the buy button, or I clicked the sell button, or if I scrolled on this list, what does this list have, or what does this list have? And essentially having these designs in the end, they really help in terms of understanding the core problem that your prototype is aiming to solve. So for example, with the example prompt, it was really the way that I approached this prototype was that it was meant to be an educational platform. And as you can see, I made it very simplistic. And if you've ever seen a stock market application, they can be quite condensed in terms of information, a lot of numbers floating around everywhere. And I try to make it as simple looking as possible while ensuring that the basics were getting across. The next thing I wanted to cover was the core functionality. And the core functionality is an absolute must to include in your prototype, because a prototype is trying to show those foundational features of the solution. And I think something that's really important to remember is that if you're unsure on whether a certain feature should be in or out, I think you should build it anyway. And this is because I think usually when you're at this stage and an idea comes across your mind, it is not one of those ideas that is unnecessarily going to bloat your application. Usually when ideas come about at this certain stage, they sort of support another feature in the application. So I highly recommend that if you're unsure as to whether a certain feature should be included or not, try and dedicate some time to build it anyway. And the key benefit of prototyping it is that as you build more of your application, you'll think of new ways to improve your existing solution. And these are things that can be kept for your documentation purposes when it comes to your final pitch, or this can be things that you may be able to fit in if, say, for example, you finish the feature implementation early. And also, it's good to keep in mind that your prototype aims to be foundational at its core. The real benefit of a prototype is that it can be built on, and once you get that critical feedback, it can also be changed. And as you can see on the right, this was a Windows application, and it's a direct translation of the reviewed design here. I believe a few more iterations on this design here to get to this final stage where this was what the final application looked like. And essentially what happened was, what I realized was the way that I had set up my application was that there was so much room to grow and build upon the application. For example, I remember that I could include more and more tabs as I decided more and more features for the application. The great thing about also having this sort of like having the review designs as well was that I could always think when I got feedback on those review designs and before I iterated, you can usually take that feedback and carry it out throughout the whole process. So for example, one of the pieces of feedback that I received was maybe don't have buy and sell next to each other because that might be hard to understand what's going on. And also it'd be better to have them on two separate sort of pages. So what I did was I essentially added a button toggle at the top here that allowed you to alternate between the buy and sell page. And so that really told me like, okay, maybe when it comes to the application, don't put two buttons super close to one another. And especially with a bunch of text, sometimes people will accidentally misclick. And that's a learning that I could carry throughout my whole prototyping phase. So that's something that I think is really important to keep in mind. And finally, user focus. And I think by far, this is the most important thing to consider. Remember the key stakeholders benefiting from or utilizing your solution, because their behaviors and needs will drive your UI functionality, design, and decisions. This is really important when it comes to your pitch as well. Your final prototype must represent your idea or response to the prompt well enough. So as you can see here at the bottom, this was just a screenshot of a spreadsheet that I had from a Google form that I had sent out to a bunch of my friends to get their feedback on my application designs. So it wasn't actually on, it was on these designs here. And basically these two columns here they were rating the designs. These three columns, they were rating the designs. And I had given them a sort of basic sort of prototype, a no-code prototype to rate the functionality. And I believe I had used Figma to sort of map out how those interactions would work. And as you can see, there was a lot more feedback that I unfortunately could not fit. But this sort of feedback allowed me to iterate and build on my solution, make it a bit better. And then if you get asked in your final pitch, hey, why did you make this certain design decision? You can always refer to this data that you have, and you can say, well, we reached out and we got some feedback, some constructive criticism, and we decided to implement this change in order to cater to these people. And I think it's really important that you do go through that review process with your prototype. Send out a Google form, send out a survey, or just exchange some messages and get some feedback on your application, because I feel like it's quite important that you do get this feedback, especially when it comes to remembering the key stakeholders that are benefiting from the solution that you're providing, especially with the prompts that you have all been given. I think it is something that it's quite, unfortunately, it's quite simple to find people that have been affected by a COVID, whether they've been in lockdown or they've been infected by COVID. It's really quite easy to find these people and sort of ask them about the idea. Hey, would you have the time to sort of go through this and sort of give me your opinions on whether you think this would be a good solution to so and so. So highly recommend having a user focus throughout the whole process and get some feedback as well. So mapping out the next two weeks. So I think in regards to these next 2 weeks, I hope that you have all secured an idea, or you have a few ideas that you're hoping to narrow down with. Hopefully the methods are provided. But we're looking at what sort of tools and resources can you all use. So I believe in the info pack that was all provided to you, we mentioned some lightweight project management tools, which include Trello, Asana, and Notion. And I think those are really great in terms of quickly getting your group onto those platforms and creating some sort of mini sprints and allocating some features and having that as your sort of project management tool, and really quick to take screenshots of it and put it into your final presentation as well. I think for the final prototype, it's also really good to have those justifications and sort of map out your process from beginning to end. So having these lightweight project management tools can be quite useful. The second bit is having like a fast yet adaptable framework or tool to deliver your prototype. So the ones that I want to cover here, the first one is React. So I hope some of you know what React is. If you don't know what React is a web framework developed by Facebook and maintained by Facebook that allows you to sort of develop web apps, single page web apps built on components, reusable components. So that's what allows it to be fast and adaptable. And the great thing is with like creating web apps, it runs on the web, it's accessible across all platforms. Another way that you can deliver your prototype, and this was covered last week with the Chinook, is Figma. And Figma is a great one because it's a no-code solution. It essentially allows you with no coding experience to create a prototype and create some designs and sort of fake the whole interaction and the computer-based and user interaction of the prototype. And finally, the one that we're going to be covering today shortly is Dart and Flutter. So we're getting into that a bit more, but that's a really great combination as well. And finally, I think the biggest thing I want to sort of like impart you with in regards to mapping out the next 2 weeks, keep some time to plan your demo. It's really important when you come to a final pitch that everything's planned out. And usually with software applications, it can be quite sort of, so to speak, it can be quite easy to run into technical difficulties when you're doing something really important, like presenting to a panel of judges. In the video games industry, they do this thing called a vertical slice, essentially, and they will take a vertical slice of what currently exists in the game. If you imagine the layers being different pieces of functionality, and they'll take a small vertical slice that represents each bit of functionality briefly. And sort of, it's a beginning to end sort of structure that they choose that sort of beginning to end path through their application or through the game to minimize the bugs, and they know it's going to work flawlessly on the days. So I highly recommend that you sort of do the equivalent, take a vertical slice of your prototype, have a plan to take the judges through a journey from the beginning of your application to the end of your application, and do it in a way that you know what's going to happen, and you're prepared to sort of face any sort of Any sort of actions that can potentially happen that uh, were not meant to happen, sort of bugs and stuff. So please do plan your demos. Next, I just want to cover some alternatives because I know React and Dart and Flutter are really, really like they're really great, but they do require coding experience. And Figma is a great no-code prototyping platform, but it is also quite complicated and it takes some time to get used to. So what are some other no-code prototype alternatives? Some great no-code prototype alternatives include Bubble, Webflow, Protopie. Protopie is paid for, but you can get a 30-day trial. InVision and Adobe InDesign. I'd also add Adobe Illustrator in there, but Adobe InDesign has they've recently added more features to it, and I feel like it's a lot more better suited for prototyping and having that user interaction element there instead of Illustrator, where Illustrator you can just sort of mock up wireframes and sketches. One thing I'd also like to highlight is with InVision, you can do a prototyping on certain features of your application, and you can sort of bring it all together in the end. So you can separate features and then bring them all together in the final solution. And you can also model user flow diagrams and customer sort of user flow diagrams and user journey maps as well with InVision. So I highly recommend InVision as well. So what about some low fidelity prototypes? So these prototyping sort of tools and resources that we've been mentioning, they're high fidelity prototypes. And for the big project, it's really good to submit a high fidelity prototype. In fact, we ask you to submit a high fidelity prototype. And a high fidelity prototype is essentially computer based. Maybe it runs on a phone or your laptop or your desktop, and it models the user interaction as well. So there should be some element of interactivity involved with it. However, if you for some reason cannot submit a high fidelity prototype, it's good to submit the following items to represent your low fidelity prototype. And this is really good to also, this is a must to include in your presentation, user flow diagrams, user journey maps, and sketches and wireframes. And these can be done through a sort of a platform, like it can be a digital drawing, it can be even sketches. Just make sure that it's visible and understandable. A common question that I actually do get asked is, what's the difference between a user flow map, user flow diagram and user journey map? And that's a great question. But I think it's really important to sort of separate the sort of physical sort of journey that a user takes and the emotional journey a user takes in some regard. So a user flow diagram focuses on the physical sort of journey of the user through the application. Okay, if I click this button, which page does it take me to? Okay, if I click the cart button, it's going to take me to the checkout page. If I click the back button, it's going to take me back to the browsing page. So it's in regards to the physical journey of the user. User journey maps, on the other hand, they focus more on how the user's feeling, the emotion, or the reactions that a user may have. So for example, okay, if I go to this, this page, for example, the browsing page, what do I expect to see? Do I expect to see a shopping cart with all my things here? Or do I expect to see a list of selectable items? When I click a radio button, for example, do I expect it to, for other radio buttons in its vicinity, am I only allowed to select one, or can I select multiple radio buttons? So it's really important that those user journey maps are there to sort of dictate how the user expects that interaction to occur, and also how they feel during that interaction with the sort of prototype. And just on that note of radio buttons should only be selectable in a group, while a tick box or a checkbox, you can select as many as you want. Sorry, I just had to mention that. But cool. I think now we go to some Dart and Flutter. And I think Dart and Flutter is probably one of the most interesting technologies that have recently come out in the last couple of years. And it's been getting a lot of support, and that is mainly because of a certain company maintaining it, and we'll get into that in a bit. But first we'll talk a bit about Dart versus Flutter, and sort of what's the difference between the two, and why do we say Dart plus Flutter or Dart and Flutter? Well, Dart is a programming language similar to things like JavaScript or Python or C Sharp or C++, while Flutter is a UI toolkit. So that's similar to like any other framework that you use. For example, that might be similar to something like Vue.js or React that you may have used in the past if you've used web development, or for example, .NET for something like C Sharp. So it's very similar, to that relationship between JavaScript and React, and sort of like C Sharp and .NET. So Dart, Flutter is a framework, and we use Dart, a programming language, to sort of utilize that framework. So what makes Dart and Flutter so amazing, so cool? So the three things I want to cover mainly is stateful hot reload, which I'll get into the next slide, single code base and cross-platform apps, and modern UI development. So I'll go over single code base cross-platform apps. So the way that Dart and Flutter has been developed is essentially that it allows you to have one code base, one sort of repository of code, and that one bit of code can be pushed to a Apple device, an iOS device, an Android device, or even a web application on the web, on your browser, so free to use. So that essentially means you don't have to spend time fine-tuning or coding 3 separate code bases. You have one code base, one sort of line of code that can be immediately translated into 3 separate platforms, which makes it quite good. And it also incorporates modern UI development. So it incorporates all the best things from like iOS Cupertino and using certain sort of components from that version of iOS, but also includes the latest features, UI features of Android, and sort of also in terms of styling as well. So like material UI and the whole, all these things that are really prevalent in modern UI development. And the final question is, who made Flutter, and is it free? And the best thing is, yes, it's free. It's like most frameworks, it's community maintained. Sorry, not community maintained. It's developed and managed by a dedicated team at Google, but also the community can contribute to it as well. So yes, it's managed by Google as well. So that means it's not going away anytime soon. And in fact, they recently, I believe, released Flutter 2.2, which incorporates a whole bunch of features. But today I'm going to be just covering some of the fundamentals. So what is hot reload and state? So hot reload, traditionally, if changes are made to an application's code, the app needs to be rebuilt in order to showcase those changes. For example, if you're programming in Java, for example, you might, if you launch the application and realize, oh no, this text box has a mistake, or this button has an improper label on it, you'll have to close the application, you have to make the change in the code, you might have to build the solution, and then you have to run it again. So it becomes quite tedious when it might be a simple mistake, a simple bug, and then you're like, oh great, I have to go and close it, make the change, restart the application. And that can be really time consuming. So a hot reload allows you to and helps you to quickly and easily experiment, build UIs, add features, and fix bugs faster by nearly instantly reloading the app without making you close down the application or rebuild the solution. It's literally like super quick. So let me just quickly get this set up. I need to press one key on this, I think, on this code, just because I know this takes a bit of time to initially launch. But yeah, I'll quickly, in the meantime, go over state. So for those of you who've done some React programming in the past, or sort of like with React, and you've worked with states a bit, you'll understand what state is, and it's very similar to what it is in Flutter. So Flutter builds its user interface to reflect the current state of your application. For example, if you had a certain sort of counter on your application, and every time you launch the application, you want that counter to increment by 1. So every time you launch the application, you'd expect that counter to go up. And essentially what would happen is that would be simple. That means just every time the application launches, just increment the counter. But what happens if we have a button on the screen that increments that same counter? Would we want to do we have to relaunch the application for that counter to change? And that's essentially what states are. Essentially, it associates a user element, user interface element. And whenever there is a change on the model side, on the data side, the whole user interface refreshes itself automatically to accommodate for that change in data. So the example is when the state of your application changes. For example, when you flip a switch in the settings menu, you can change the state and it triggers a redraw, a refresh of the whole user interface. So I just want to do a quick demo real quick. And this is a sort of emulator that I'm just running on my computer. And another great thing about having Flutter is that you can do this whole thing on VS Code. So if you ran this on on a MacBook, you'd be able to access the iPhone emulator, but because I'm running on this on Windows, I only have access to the Android emulator. But as you can see here, there's a bunch of code. I'm not expecting you all to understand it, but essentially the key thing to note here is that every time we click this button, this sort of counter goes up and it just keeps going. And that's essentially what state is. We've essentially tied the state of this label. So for example, this text field. And essentially what happens is whenever the data within this text field changes, so the counter changes, we trigger a redraw. And I'll quickly show you what that sort of state change looks like and how we model it. So as you can see here, we have this increment counter sort of code. And essentially what we do is we set the state of the counter to be an increment. So plus plus essentially means we're just adding 1 to the current saved number. So we're incrementing the counter by 1. And by doing set state, we're setting the state of that variable to where we're updating that variable. And as a result of setting that state, essentially we're triggering a redraw of the application. So as soon as I click this, it updates the number on the model side on the back end. So it makes it 13. And then because that number changes on the back end and it knows because we're using this set state sort of method, it refreshes the whole thing. So as you can see, it just refreshes almost instantaneously. And essentially, we're going to get into a bit more into detail as to what this sort of is, but essentially, that's what state is. It just triggers when the state of your application changes. Essentially, it will refresh the whole view, and it will keep everything the same on the data side, which can be quite useful in terms of making dynamic applications. For example, if you had a toggle button to show a certain picture, if you click that toggle, it would appear. And if you untick that toggle, it would disappear. You wouldn't have to re-enter the screen or leave the screen. It would just immediately come into effect. And the other thing I wanted to quickly talk about was hot reload. So hot reload is essentially this idea of changing code, and you don't have to worry about it. You don't have to worry about rebuilding the solution. So for example, you can see here that we have the text, you have pushed the button this many times. And you can see we've got it right here. So let me try and do this. I think that'll be a bit better because then we can sort of have them next to each other. So what happens if we say you have pushed the plus button? And notice I haven't saved it yet, but as soon as I do a control S, as soon as I do a control S, it will say it will be performing a hot reload. And as you can say, you have pushed the plus button this many times. And essentially it just instantly refreshes the application. And what we can do is we can even add more elements to this whole thing. So we can add another text field, honestly, at the bottom. And we can say, the second one is the number is, you can save it. And essentially what will happen is we've just added more text. And this is one of the great things about Flutter and Dart is this idea of hot reloading, because you can essentially prototype on the fly. allowing you to quickly add new things to your application without having to rebuild, without having to spend time waiting. You don't have to go make a cup of coffee. You can just make a change and it'll be there already. And that's one of the great things about having Flutter and Dart, and especially in the idea of the big project, is prototyping fast iterations on what you're making. And this is a great way to do so. So yeah, that's essentially what hot reload is and state. The next thing I wanted to quickly cover is how do you build things with Flutter? And if you've used React before, you can think of widgets similar to components or elements on the screen for those of you who haven't done React. Widgets describe their view based on their configuration and state. Simply put, widgets can dynamically change based on their data, the data associated with them. And widgets are intended to be reusable. So for example, as you can see here on this left side, we have this sort of tree diagram of sorts. And we have this sort of tab. You might have seen this tab if you've used Android before, or it's just similar, something that you might have seen in any app that you've used. But this is essentially how a widget works. Essentially, we have a container widget. Sorry, I think my camera went off there for a second. But essentially, you have a container widget, and essentially that houses a bunch of things in it. And essentially what happens is that with the container widget, it contains a bunch of things. So as you can see, it contains a row. That row there is essentially this whole section right here, this whole component right here. And within this row, we have 3 separate columns. And you can think of these 3 separate columns as each one of these sections. So within a column, we have, this is one column, this is the second column, and this is the third column. And within each column, we have an icon and a container, and we have some text associated with that container. So the way that you can see it is that, okay, we have an icon at the top here, and we have a container that's adjacent to it, so to speak. And that container, within that container is a piece of text. So as you can see, it's pretty much the same thing with the second widget, with the route widget, sorry. And as you can see, it's the same for the third. So this becomes really useful in terms of reusability, because we can reuse this whole sort of widget structure 2 times. And if we wanted to add 2 more elements to this row, we could just add 2 more elements like that. And it'd be quite simple. And I think one of the best things is with having these sort of widgets is that you can define your own custom layouts based on the need of your application. For example, you might need a certain column and with the same sort of data in it based on a certain scenario. For example, for a menu bar, it might be useful. But for example, you might not need this, you might not need the text for just a series of buttons, so a series of icons on the top of your application. So it can be quite dynamic and reusable. And essentially, layouts are a complex collection of widgets. So the way we can view this is that this is a widget tree, and each one of these subsections, like a row, is essentially defines a layout for all the widgets. And this container defines the whole layout of the whole entire row. And you can really go into detail. So you can say this column defines the layout of the icon and the container with the text in it. So there is that element to it there. And finally, some demo time. So quickly just show you how we can sort of utilize this sort of reusable aspect of the whole reusable widget aspect of Dart and Flutter. So as you can see here, we have, this is a lot of code. I don't expect it all to make sense to you, but essentially you can see keywords are starting to pop out now, like widgets and build. So let me just collapse some of these. So as you can see here, we have actually 3 different widgets, right? So we have our events list widget, we have an event card widget, and we have a favorite widget. Now, the events list widget is stateless, which means that it's not going to be dynamic. We don't expect it to be dynamic. Similar to an event card, we don't expect it to be sort of dynamic. We don't want it to sort of change its form or anything. However, the favorite widget is something that we do want to change. We want the favorite option or the favorite button to essentially act as a button. So as I bring this application up here, that's cool. There it is. I can collapse that for now. But as you can see, we have this this is an app that I prototyped in a couple of hours. So this is really quick to do, and you can get a lot out of you can get a lot out of Dart and Flutter by utilizing it. And you can, if you work in a team, even faster. So as you can see here, I have like sort of a scrollable sort of thing with TechSoc events that you can potentially attend. As you can see, it's running on an Android emulator. We got a sort of like a fancy little logo at the top. We got a bunch of cards to represent each event. So let's start from the top. So we just define what a society event is going to be, like a class that you've done in programming fundamentals. So each event has an ID, it has a title, description, date, image part. So that's just where we get the image from, and a link. And I'll go into the link. Actually, I might as well just show you what the link is now. So if we wanted to go and see what this, let's see what the big project is all about. So if we click it, it will actually launch the Facebook event link in your browser. So you can just immediately view, oh, okay, this is what the event is all about. And then you can just click back and you go right back to your application. So that's essentially what each clickable, that's what the link is for each event. So this society events list is essentially what it is essentially. It's a whole bunch of, it's essentially a grid view. This whole list is essentially a 1 column, 4 row grid. And the thing about grid views is they're infinite. They can go as long as you want, but you just got to define the number of columns. So if I really wanted to, I could increase the number of elements that I wanted to have, number of columns that I wanted for this grid view. So if I just did 2, I just click save, and this is the whole idea of hot reloading again. And essentially what you can see is that it's a bit more compressed, but now we've got all 4 there. But I like the view of having just 1 take up majority of my screen. So we'll keep it like that. And we only have 4 events in this current application. But essentially that's the grid view. And for each element in the grid view, we actually have this thing called an event card. And this event card contains a society event. So let's quickly collapse this list widget right here. And let's have a look at the event card and see how that's sort of set up. So each event card is tied to a society event. And each event card is essentially a grid tile for the grid list view. And there's a bunch of things here. It is quite confusing. And by the way, I am giving you access to this source code afterwards. So feel free to dive into my code, critique my code, because I'm not the best Flutter and Dart developer, but you can definitely get a lot out of it, and sort of see what I've done in terms of getting the URLs to launch and the favorite button and everything. But essentially what I have here, I can break down these 3 areas of the grid tile into 3 components. The header, and the header contains a text, and it's just a bunch of colors. It's almost like CSS if you've done HTML programming before. And essentially what we have here is the society title, which is, the event title, which is the community catch-ups. And in this case, software engineering panel. And essentially what this is essentially that's all that's in the header, and that's the top of our whole grid tile. The second element is the sort of what we call the child component. And the child component, when you click on it, it launches a URL to the society link. And the great thing about Dart and Flutter, it sort of, because it is a framework that it knows that it's an app, it will launch it in an associated browser or an application that is associated with HTML links. So this will launch in a browser on the application, which is great. And as you can see, we've sort of set the child to be the child of this sort of grid tile, the child of the grid tile, to be the image that we have, which we get from an image widget, which we define elsewhere as well. And you can see how we define this image widget right here to get the image and stuff. It looks quite complicated, but trust me, it becomes quite easy in terms of once you start to understand what to look for, how reusable it is. So essentially, we have one event card definition, but we've got 4 event cards. So as you can see, it promotes that idea of reusability. And finally, bringing in the whole idea of stateful components. So for stateful components, you actually need to do 2 separate declarations. So let me sort of collapse that real quick. So you need to do like declaring it as a stateful sort of widget, and then describing what happens with the state. So this widget's called the favorite widget, and essentially all this widget is, it's essentially for the favoriting of stuff and the unfavoriting of stuff. And essentially what happens is when you click on this icon, which is just an icon button, it will change the state and it will change the color or the fill color of the icon. And essentially what happens is it will run this command and it will say, if it is currently favorited, then you want to set it to not favorited. But if it wasn't favorited, then by clicking on the button, you do want to favorite it. And we set that state. So the application automatically refreshes. And as you can see is once we click it, it immediately shows that, hey, we've favorited the application. Or if we untick it, we've unfavorited the application. So yeah, that's a quick overview of widgets and stuff. And each one of these favorite widgets, we only have to declare it once, but we can use those favorite widgets in the bottom of the footer right here. We can just essentially add it just there. So as you can see, there's like a lot of reusability, and there is a huge component of like having those dynamic applications. And it's a really great way to sort of incorporate Dart and Flutter into building your prototype. So yeah, and you'll get access to this code. I am going to share this in the coming days with all of you. So feel free to dive into the code and see if you want to pursue Dart and Flutter. And yeah, cool. So I think we went forward. Yeah, perfect. So finally, we'll just talk a bit about the criteria for the big project. And in regards to prototyping, I've sort of isolated the key things that need to be followed. In regards to point number 2, which is group has developed supporting materials and or artifacts that showcase their creative journey. I think something that's really important is that those supporting materials. So your initial designs, your maybe meeting minutes even, and also map out your processes for selecting ideas. So for example, the 4 categories method or the 6 thinking hats method. So I highly recommend point number 2 for that. Number 3 is justifying your potential audience. And that comes as a result of doing those activities between the ideate and prototype phase, trying to narrow down those ideas and essentially reflecting those learnings within the design, sort of adjusting your idea based on those learnings that you've gotten from those activities. And what are you trying to address, and especially answer these questions. And I highly recommend putting those questions as headings or addressing those questions directly in your presentation. Number 4 is your final prototype is innovative and shows evidence of consideration of design principles. So essentially, being innovative essentially means that you might take, I think the whole thing about inventing an idea, which means you've created from scratch, is great. But being innovative is essentially, you can have an existing idea, an idea that already exists out there, but you're bringing something new to it, something that hasn't been brought before, and essentially allows you to redefine what the initial sort of idea can do. And that's what it means for it to be innovative. It doesn't have to be a completely fresh idea. It can be something that takes an existing sort of solution and makes it even better in your own unique way. So show that it's innovative and show evidence of the consideration of design principles. So once again, wireframes, sketches, getting surveys done, and also as a team, what have you all thought about it? Number 5, prototype is your final prototype is high fidelity and displays polish and consideration of aesthetics. And so that's what, with all the considerations that we gave you, or sorry, the alternate sort of tools, those are some really important things that will allow you to develop that polish and sort of consideration and aesthetic, because those are modern platforms that use the latest design principles reflected in their capabilities and such. So Dart and Flutter uses modern UI development. Figma also allows you to custom create your components, and React is the most common current web framework out there. So definitely it's showing that it's modern and you're using the correct aesthetics as well. Number 6 is evidence of thinking and planning around the creation of the prototype, your inspirations, and why you've chosen why have you chosen a Southern OS to develop your prototype application. So yeah, like once again, I think really important to highlight why you chose a Southern OS. So if you decide not to go with Dart and Flutter, if you went with React, why did you choose web only with React? And if you've decided any other frameworks, maybe it might be a C# .NET application, why have you chose the Windows environment to predominantly run the application on? And it's important to answer these questions because it really ties back to the end user and how you're choosing to target your end user and help them with your solution. And finally, number 7, showcasing your prototype in action. And this goes back to the demo, really showcasing each piece of core functionality and making sure that you're really, with this core functionality that you're showcasing, you're directly tackling each part of the prompt and essentially making sure that your idea is really well represented and showing that in your slide deck, planning out your demo and such. I think I am just 1 minute over time. So for those of you who need to leave, I'll come back to this QA slide here. But for now, thank you so much for coming along today's fundamentals of prototyping workshop, and a bit of Dart and Flutter to also help you out on your big project journey. Some key reminders from the team here at UTS Tech Society. Remember, your submission is due on the 9th of September. Be sure to submit a prototype and a brief outline of your presentation. Remember, there is also another workshop next week, and it's on the 2nd of September. And it's from Amara, our former president from last year. And she's coming back to give an amazing talk on how to prepare for your pitch. So definitely come for that. She is by far one of the best public speakers, and she'll have so many insights. So please do come and support her, and definitely have a listen to what she has to say, because I know for a fact that she's done many of these, so she'll definitely have some great insights. Please also be sure to check out the Big Project Facebook group for any alerts or any updates from the UTS Tech Society team, and also keep out for our weekly newsletter. Lots of great info is going to be included on there, including the link, sort of like a mini guide to Dart and Flutter that will be prepared by me. Essentially, just a brief overview of some resources to set up Dart and Flutter, and also some great getting started resources, and also links to the repos for both the startup application, which was just the counter, and also the Tech Society application. So yeah, that is essentially that for the workshop. If you would like to stick around, I probably have time for like 1 question or 2 questions, as many questions as you want. But yeah, oh, I think the chat's been blowing up while I've been presenting. Yes, the repo will be available afterwards. And also, yep, I believe you will also get a copy of the slides as well. Did anyone have any questions in regards to any sort of anything about prototyping or Dart and Flutter? I'm happy to give it like 5 minutes of sorts to answer any questions that you may have. Okay, cool. Is Dart and Flutter code consistent across both devices, i.e. iOS and Android? That's a great question. I think I'll quickly hop over to the code right now. And I just want to quickly show you the sort of structure of the folders just to answer that question. So as you can see, there's quite a lot of folders when it comes to Dart and Flutter. And I mean, you are developing for 3 separate code bases. So that's important to consider. The first folder I want to highlight is the Android folder. So the Android folder contains files specific to just Android development only. So whenever you click, there's actually a command to run to build your final solution. This is just me debugging. But when you finally build your final solution, essentially what happens is all the necessary Android files will go into the Android folder. Likewise, the necessary iOS files will go into the iOS folder. And likewise, the necessary web files or resources will go into the web folder. And any sort of common sort of resources for the application will go into this build folder right here. It's really jumbled, it's super confusing, but essentially that's the common space for all your build, like for all your application code. So yes, it is essentially consistent. So if I were to give this code to someone who, like for example, if you were to clone this on a Mac OS X device, essentially after installing Dart and Flutter onto your computer, there's a little extension for VS Code to sort of enable that development layer. You'll get this sort of option at the bottom that you can click here. And you get all these different sort of platforms to run your application on. And if you're running it on a MacBook, you will have access to, it will say an iPhone emulator there. Like you can choose whether you want like to simulate a 10er, like the iPhone 12, or like whatever iPhone you want, or whatever iOS device, even an iPad and such. And so, yeah, essentially, if I gave this code to someone else, they would essentially click down here, they'd launch the iPhone emulator, they'd press F5, it would run the application on that iPhone as well. So yes, the code is consistent across both devices, iOS, Android, and also the web as well. Cool. Thank you for that question, though. Any other question? Yes, I think Dylan brings up a really good point. There is some extra sort of configuration that is involved with getting the sort of iPhone sort of emulation or simulators running. Yeah, Dylan's quick tip is great. If you don't mind me, I'll take that and also include that in the setup guide. And I see Dylan's offering his support for iOS stuff in the Discords, which is great to see. And I think also in the setup guides that are in the sort of resources that I'll provide in the setup guide, there are some really great links to how to set up for a sort of Windows development or mainly iOS development and stuff. So there is that sort of option there as well. But yeah, no, thank you, Dylan, for the quick tip as well. Any other questions from anyone? If not, I think I'm happy to call it there. If you do have any questions, please do reach out to me. I'm on the TechSoc Discord. If you just ping me, I'll be happy to have a look at any queries you may have. I hope that you guys got a lot out of the workshop, and I hope that this sort of also helps beyond the big project as well. Maybe you take it out into your careers or into your uni assignments. But I'm super, super excited to see what you will produce for your high fidelity prototypes for the 9th of September. And I look forward to seeing you at next week's workshop from Amara on pitching, and also at the final pitch night. Thank you so much. And I hope everyone has a lovely night and a great week. And I'll see you next time. Thanks, everyone.